on what you should be investigating in the network. A little bit about me. Spent about 10 years in the Air Force, a little bit of time at the intelligence community. I'm primarily a software engineer by trade and did a bit of network analytics. Spent most of my time analyzing network traffic, looking for malicious actors as they move through networks laterally and across WANs and stuff like that. I'll let Chris introduce himself.
Yep, so I'm Chris, like John, former military, a little bit of time in the intelligence community and sailing on Navy ships. Currently I'm a threat researcher and analyst at FLX, and I work with a data scientist to build our automated analytics right now. So I enjoy doing a lot of threat emulation and then endpoint and network forensics, kind of like John.
What we're going to talk about today is kind of this concept of actor intent and how their realization of their intent is actually what causes the business loss to companies and organizations, and kind of an abstract way to determine if they have intent in your network versus just having some kind of malicious code or malware or annoying Ask Jeeves toolbar land in your network that something is flagging on as malicious. We're going to talk a little bit about a proposal on a new way, not a new way, but an interesting way to collect very specific telemetry to help illustrate this concept of intent. I'll go through a couple case studies on some recent presentations and recent reports that were released earlier in the year. Talk about how we did the technical execution to demonstrate this, and then kind of show the application of what it is we're doing. So bottom line is that defenders should target threats that have intent. Business loss doesn't usually just come from the fact that something bad's in your network. It comes from the fact that there's a human on the other end of the line who's trying to do something, right? And you know, whether it's PII or intellectual property exfiltration, as of recently, lots of ransomware and mass ransomware distribution. You know, most of you are probably familiar with San Fran at this point. And of course, downtime. The downtime it takes away to take the systems down, do incident response, and bring it back up. So the main takeaway is that what we try to emphasize with folks we work with is you should try to find out if the actions going on in your network are going to lead to something bigger. The one way we look at doing this is looking at post-exploit activity. And once someone gets into your network, they're going to come back if they give a crap. If they don't, they might leave it there for a while. They might do health and wellness checks. They might just babysit implants looking for the right time to come back. In most cases, we find lateral movement is always required to get to where it is you're going, right? And there's a lot of discussion and talk about lateral movement, but what I find is there's kind of a lack of making that link between lateral movement is usually a precursor to some kind of intent that is going to come into fruition and impact your network, right? And in today's day and age, actors are living off of the lands, right? There's PowerShell, there's WMI, there's everything that they need built in to move around stealthily. Or is it stealthy just because no one's auditing every move they make using those tools? Or is there a lack of collection? Some of the things we kind of want to explore. So what we say by split your alerts is not like splitting stocks to make more of them, is to split them into priority queue, right? And so our core philosophy here is that you should focus on your events, your investigations that involve lateral movement, as they often are indicative of actor intent. And then everything else comes priority. Most stuff that you're going to deal with might not have lateral movement. That's fine. But you need to be thinking about, how do I detect it? How can I react to it? Around the clock for the couple times that does happen. So this gets into the kind of how we want to do this and how we propose to do this is this telemetry collection of trying to answer who went where, when, using what. Two types of telemetry that we are really interested in trying to automate the collection and multiplexing of is network telemetry and endpoint telemetry. So I love network telemetry. I love network analytics. I think it really answers the question of lateral movement, right? If you can collect traffic from, you know, even as low as your access and distribution layers in your network, you can kind of have an out-of-band collected data reference that illustrates where every computer is talking to in your network, right? And of course, if someone is moving laterally in your infrastructure, they're going to have to use network connectivity, and then you have that stored somewhere. Granted, it is a haystack, and you have to extract it out of there. But this is where we want to get into combining additional telemetry to enrich this base forensic set of network telemetry. I'll let Chris talk a little bit about the endpoint.
Yeah, so like John was saying, what we want to try to do is tie the endpoint side into the network side, and network side being the ground truth of where someone went. What we see a lot in endpoint tools is while they might monitor something like a network connection that'll give you a 5-tuple or something you can pivot off, it's not their primary focus. They're looking at things like loaded module, what files were accessed, things like that. So it's fusing those two things together, like John mentioned, a trusted source like out-of-band collection, and then fusing that with things like what process were they using, what is the checksum of that file, what event logs were created. Those type of things play into the endpoint telemetry. And when we put those together, like I mentioned, off a 5-tuple, or if maybe you just have a timestamp and an approximation of what a process should do, sewing those things together kind of builds our telemetry pattern, which John will show you in a minute.
Yep, yeah, so the whole idea here is instead of storing some of this key telemetry in their individual silos, can we combine them either on the fly or retroactively to give you some kind of master record? This is a JSON blob that resulted from the data set that we're using. And it's basically a combination of layer 3 for NetFlow data that has been actually resessionized based off a tracking state, combined with a bunch of endpoint telemetry that we actually pulled off a Carbon Black. So this includes the PID, the command line invocation, the process path, a bunch of other goodies that we can send into something like Elasticsearch or Solr, and now you have this fully queryable set of traffic and processes that you can audit for the lateral movement, all using friendly search syntaxes like Lucene. So we'll go through a couple examples. We'll start with the baby example, and then we'll move it on up. There was a recent report out from Intel Security about distribution of the SamSam ransomware. Bottom line is that you have a web-facing server, maybe with a web shell or something that gets compromised, and once they're on there, they gain the credentials they need, and they invoke something like CSVDE. In this specific example, what they did was they used that to dump all the computers out of the OU from Active Directory, loaded that into a file, pinged the ones to see which ones responded, and then they passed the SamSam ransomware up there with the copy command, and then psexec it. They renamed the psexec executable something else because for funsies, thinking it's going to maybe stop someone auditing psexec. I don't know why, but good for them. This tradecraft can be used basically to distribute anything across your network, right? It just so happens they're looking to do it from a ransomware perspective. So thinking about automating the distribution and launching of ransomware using an automated technique like this, as we are starting to see more and more, could be extremely damaging to the operations of a business. So our theory here is that the traffic collection, if you can merge it using this kind of data set here, you can simply say, hey, show me all the traffic that's generated by psexec. Now, since they're super stealthy and renamed it, maybe we can use the MD5 because we'll have that from our endpoint telemetry merged in and kind of get that network map of saying, here's where the distribution of this particular binary went on the network. And then, of course, you can kind of extend this by doing some, hashtag data science or hashtag statistics on kind of recurring patterns in your network to see if this is normal usage. And I'm going to hand it off to Chris to kind of go over a more advanced example.
So many of you guys have seen this talk from the Mandiant guys. They did it at DerbyCon, they did it at ShmooCon, pretty much all over the place. Very interesting breach that they presented on. They recently called it out as APT29 or Cozy Bear. So a variety of tactics, including deception techniques. Just a really fascinating talk if you get a chance to take a look at it. So what we're seeing that we think would be interesting from a telemetry perspective that could have put this together quicker is the PowerShell usage, and they didn't use Wimic specifically. They used PowerShell to invoke their WMI commands. But tying those things together and looking at these things in a telemetry sense, we could see something like PowerShell connecting to another victim host, launching something like the WMI process, which will then spawn another PowerShell. You put those things together from a network perspective, and now you can tailor where you actually need to go. And then you look for other, maybe they're putting down one of their, they mentioned their advanced backdoor and then their basic backdoor. You follow that process stream, you can see exactly where they're laterally moving. And so kind of as the counterpart to what John mentioned with the SamSam stuff, we would want to ask as an incident responder or defender, show me something that involves WMI and PowerShell. Show me what that graphs out to, where they went. And then the network traffic will kind of connect the dots for you there.
So how we kind of piece this together, we're fortunate enough in our lab that we have a partnership with Carbon Black, so we just went ahead and used their stuff to do our endpoint telemetry collection. There's a few other tools out there that folks can use as well. We're evaluating OS Query, although it's not a real-time streaming of telemetry. It does give you some of the information you would need. Sysmon's another good tool that we're actually playing with as well, and using that actually logs all the network connections that an endpoint process launch or a process would make, and then also can track process launches. So, and then from the network telemetry side, we're using an open source tool called Argus. Argus is really cool in the sense that it actually maintains bidirectionality, gives you a sense of what the state is that allowed us to actually kind of resessionize. So you don't want to have massive amounts of flows for a single session. We can kind of keep a single session object together. And then what we did is we kind of just orchestrated these two tools. I'm not sure we have like a Carbon Black users in here, but you have a way to they provide a way to siphon off the raw sensor events from their endpoints, and pretty much you don't even have to pay attention to their back-end collection analysis. You can actually, it's just a raw Google protobuf, you can parse it and then dump it. And so we dumped all the stuff into just a log file in JSON format. And then with a couple, like 100 lines of Apache Spark, we're able to basically parse all those JSON into data frames in memory, where we just run basic SQL commands over it. So SQL joins all day long to pivot off of the 5 tuples, parse off of the PIDs and the process launch times, and then we have that results in that master JSON blob that we showed a few slides back, and we send that bad boy into Elasticsearch, and then we can use Kibana on top of that to actually, first of all, do full text queries on whatever you want. We've experimented with doing dashboards, show me every hour process launch information for certain types of processes that are native to your organization, native to Windows, and then from there you can actually build really cool visualizations using the Graph plugin. So this is the SamSam distribution that we used with the built-in Graph plugin for Kibana. Since they're super awesome and renamed PSExec, we just kind of yanked out an MD5 of a PSExec version, and we're able just to query this. So this is the graph that comes back from a simple search on this MD5. No fields, no nothing, full text search because we're using Elasticsearch. And what we get is this graph that has a pretty dense centricity on that center 10.10.4.6 in the middle here. And then what we did is we added 3 different types of vertices: source IP, dest IP, and then the command line invocation of processes. And so what you're seeing on those blue, teal, greenish tags is the actual command line invocation that linked these nodes together, right? And so when we executed our PSExec to launch it, these are the 4 victims that we launched it on, right? So this is a single query that gives you a topology graph that kind of shows exactly what was going on your network. So these are the kind of things you can automate and run over and over again, right? From a threat hunting perspective, can be really useful to kind of audit this kind of behavior, right? Especially when you start to see dense clusters like this, unless it's normal for users to pass this kind of stuff around your network. Again, something you might be able to model and normalize. The bottom right kind of shows the exact command that was logged from our endpoint collection. Was firing off samsam.exe. We didn't actually do this to ourselves. I think it was like renamed to calc or something. So it was the great calc attack of 2016 in our test network. And then this next slide will actually show the kind of APT29 type activity.
So let me start out by saying that I didn't do APT29 justice here. There's a lot of not so stealthy things I did on here, but one of the interesting things, going back to the Mandiant breach, is they stated that sometimes their initial compromise would be a lot more noisy than the lateral movement that you'd see later. Almost as one of those deception things. Oh, we got it under control. We neutralized that box. We got their back door. It's all over until it's not. So not entirely out of the realm of possibility. So essentially what we have here is the use of the PowerShell to start off. You see our friend 10.10.4.6 there. It happens to be a forward-facing web server. What that has, we use the web shell to execute PowerShell and download some tools. With some very stealthy names there on the bottom right. And then from there, once we got up on there, we did CSVD, recon again, and then from there moved on to 10.10.4.50. One of the reasons I say I didn't do APT29 justice because we've got PSExec running on there, pretty obvious thing. Similarly, WMI, my suspicion based on looking at the breach notes, they were probably tunneling that PowerShell stuff through one of their back doors or through another process. So you wouldn't see necessarily these WMI, these clear command lines of what's going on. However, if you had, like we have these bad backdoor names here, if you knew it was tunneled through bad.exe, you could pretty clearly search for bad.exe and follow the trail of these network connections to where they're actually going. So just an example of a little bit more complex lateral movement breach.
So future applications that we can kind of see of taking this kind of telemetry set. First one is alerting, right? Everyone who is in network defense has some kind of alert queue or some kind of work queue. They sit down and say, here's what events I'm going to investigate, whether it's specific types of logs in your log aggregation systems where I investigate, massive amounts of failed login attempts, or you have something that is doing kind of that next-gen AV role where it's identifying hosts that have really anomalous behavior. A lot of the newer vendors out there have, advanced analytics using different types of machine learning models to try to identify anomalies to accelerate threat hunting. The whole idea here is if you have like this master transactional record of processes and the network traffic they generate, can I say, look, for every alert that I have, let me query my master data set and immediately try to investigate if there is some kind of post or pre-alert tradecraft, and specifically lateral movement, as we want to really zero in on that, as again, our core thesis is that lateral movement means essentially, winter is coming if they're successful in what they're doing, and you should really be on the lookout for that. Hunting value there, right? You can hunt by query, seems like a really great thing to us. I think the industry kind of went from a threat hunting perspective, kind of went from a crawl to a full out like Olympic gold medal sprint with all these machine learning tools that are out there, combing over massive Hadoop data sets and all that stuff, right? But what if you can just kind of take your data set that it's good enough and just query for things? Hey, show me daily roll-ups of PowerShell and WMI usage. Show me, can I basically track where my administrators go in the network? And then when I see someone doing something that looks like an administrator and they're not an administrator, I can start to investigate that from a hunting perspective. And finally, incident response. Working with a lot of incident responders, getting the full picture quicker is something we've really valued working with them on. They spend a lot of time drawing things out on whiteboards, kind of collecting data in all different fields that they can. Oftentimes they don't know the environment they're in. So what we advocate for with a lot of our customers and clients is like, look, can you get a base level of really good collection, almost like a DVR of this data set, so when someone comes in, they can be like, oh, cool, I have this awesome data set I can just query to do whatever I need. And then some food for thought, really forward-thinking stuff. I'll let Chris go over it.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hacking Team breach, you can determine whether it's a work of science fiction or whatever, but essentially what went on here is a gentleman claimed to have compromised the Hacking Team network, and he kind of laid out on Pastebin how he used all these tools. So this is kind of one we don't have all the answers to. How do you make this telemetry in a mixed environment like this? The quick summary of it is he said he compromised a forward-facing embedded device and then pivoted from there first onto a backup server, looked at a Mongo share, which he didn't, or a Mongo DB that wasn't very interesting, and then from there used stuff from the backups to pivot into the domain environment. And as you see there, we kind of all know what happens when you get into the domain environment, which is two of the things that we just presented. Use your living off the land tools, copy your files everywhere, and it's pretty much game over. So what we were kind of thinking about is how do we catch this when it's actually happening with just an Nmap scan, or is there an agent that runs on Mongo or on your Docker container that's running Mongo? And then as business data moves to the cloud, because it would be nice to say that all of our business critical data is in our network, more and more we're seeing that move out to the cloud. What type of agents are we running there? Is it out-of-band collection like VPC flow logs or other things that we have to use to build this common telemetry that we can use for incident response, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud? So this, like John said, this is food for thought. This is things to think about because I think we're only going to see this transition accelerate going forward.
So challenges in this, and kind of a way ahead as we see it. I think there's a big wide open space for security by telemetry. And what I mean by that is if you can collect the right data set, ask relevant questions, even simple yes or no questions to start, you can kind of get ahead of the game, right? A good question is WMI being used today? If I know it's not astronomically normal in my network, bad question to ask, am I hacked? I don't know. Like, figure out the small things first, piece it together to get something bigger. I think a lot of other tools out there try to jump to that question, especially some of the other vendor tools where it's just a magic box you plug in and it pulls your ingress, egress traffic and then spits out some kind of answer that says, oh, this host is totally hacked because it did something anomalous because someone is running Spotify. Like, maybe not, maybe it's a lot of false positives, but what is the use of it when they take all this awesome telemetry in themselves and then they dump it because they're just spitting out the results of their analytics? I think there's a somewhat of an industry issue with the fact that a lot of the industry tools that folks pay for don't give you the raw telemetry that they have, and some of it could be really, really useful telemetry if you could just store it and merge it with the other telemetry you have. The SecOps data set should be a core data set that you can use to rapidly answer questions, right? Lots of logs have to be collected and stored, but they're not necessarily relevant for day-to-day security operations. So what we advocate for is don't settle for existing data if you need better. And it's also challenging, right? It's challenging to work with the IT members, who have to maintain these systems and enable the NetFlow or the JFlow or whatever tools are out there to get this kind of network telemetry. But if you can get it and start maybe in an area of your network that is sensitive than others, you can kind of start to log that and start to build this base. I need my go-to drink at a bar is like a bourbon club. So sometimes I order something crazy, right? And that's something crazy is maybe something I have in kind of a colder storage, right? But I know that I have this go-to based data set. I talked about Sysmon. It's a really awesome tool that came out a couple years ago that is really good for auditing all the stuff that's going on in your Windows hosts. That is we're evaluating that as a way to kind of collect the NetFlow telemetry and combine it with that to give the kind of the same data set, right? Because if we can do this all with open source, then we're empowering people even more. And then finally, harass the crap out of your vendors. Being someone on the vendor side as well, I get harassed, and so I like getting harassed because that means we can build things that people want and need. And I've seen other vendors love getting that kind of brutal harassment that says, like, yeah, this is really cool, but can you just give me this instead? And especially when they want to get under the hood and say, can you just give me this raw data? Some folks are somewhat pretty responsive to that. And don't settle for having to use the data you have. Don't MacGruber it together. And I think that's basically it. Any questions?
You're taking, you have from the endpoint telemetry of the network information, what value do you get from merging all the NetFlow on top?
Sure. So the question was, if we're getting like 5-tuple network connectivity out of the endpoint itself, why do we need to overlay it with flow? We found two big things there. One of them being that mostly we just get a 5-tuple, and we can't really get any other information about what the session looked like. And so we've gotten a lot of use out of like saying volume, like how much traffic was actually sent over these connections, where we can kind of sum it up in the NetFlow data. We can actually get how much data was sent and received. We can get durations, and we can also revert back to the actual raw flows themselves and kind of map out what the session looked like over time. Looking at, you can kind of look at the session lifespan and look at how much was sent and received over it and determine, is it an interactive type session? Is it a full file transfer? So you get context that way. And also, because of these blended environments, actually back to one of the previous ones we had on when we did the pseudo replication at ABT 29, where we actually set up a binds backdoor, is that we actually connected in from another host to that backdoor that didn't have endpoint telemetry on it, but we could kind of pivot off of that because if you're collecting network telemetry higher up, you might get more bang for your buck with a single collector than you would an endpoint agent. All right, well, thanks a lot, and enjoy your lunch.